A listener who signs as Andres sent me this message a few days ago. He told me he had never shared this with anyone outside his family. What he experienced happened when he was 32 years old, in the house where he grew up, taking care of his sick father. If you have something similar kept inside, you know the comments are open. This is what Andres wrote to me. There are things that one doesn't share because they know no one will believe them, not because the story is extraordinary, but because it lives exactly on the edge between what can be proven and what cannot. I repeated it to myself for a long time. It was stress. It was exhaustion. It was the mind of someone who hasn't slept well for weeks. I told myself this until there was one thing I couldn't explain with any of those reasons. And that's what made me write to this channel. My father's name was Rogelio. A carpenter by trade, a man of few words, with large rough hands that permanently smelled of wood and varnish. When I was a child, I felt invincible. When I saw him for the first time in a hospital bed, connected to tubes, with that pallor that people have when their bodies begin to give in, something in me broke in a way that never fully healed. The diagnosis was heart failure with complications. The doctors were honest. My father was going to need permanent care. I am the oldest son. I have a brother, Marcos, who lives in another city. We agreed that I would take care of things for the first few months while he sorted out his affairs to come and support me. I left my apartment and moved into my parents' house. My mother had died when I was 15, so it was a house that had been solely my father's for almost 20 years. Large for one person, with that silent accumulation of objects that older people's houses have. Furniture that hasn't been moved in decades. Boxes that haven't been opened. Photographs on the walls of a life that I only knew halfway. In the first few days, I was busy organizing everything. Medications, schedules, doctor's visits, calls to the hospital. Activity is an efficient way to avoid thinking. I would throw myself on the bed every night completely exhausted. It was in the second week when I started to notice the door. The house had a long hallway that connected the living room with the rooms at the back. At the end of that hallway, to the right, there was a dark wooden door, smaller than the others, with a metal handle that over the years had acquired that dull color of uncleaned metal. The first time I noticed it was because it was slightly open. I didn't think much of it. Old houses have doors that don't close well. I closed it without thinking and continued with what I was doing. But the next morning it was slightly open again, and the next one, I started to pay attention to it. Behind it was a small, almost empty room, a wooden chair in the center, facing the back wall as if someone had placed it there to sit and look at the wall. And on that wall, at mid-height, there was a dark stain. It wasn't a crack. It wasn't dampness. It was an old stain, with irregular edges, a color between brown and black that absorbed the little light that came in through the only dirty window. I asked my father what that room was. Something in his expression changed in a very small way, but I noticed it because I have known him my whole life. Storage room, he said. There's nothing in there. There's a chair, I said. He didn't respond immediately. Leave it, he finally said. Don't use that room. Why? Because I'm asking you, he said, and he turned his gaze to the television. That night before going to bed, I went back to the hallway. The door was ajar. I stood in front of it in the darkness, with only the light from my father's room filtering under his door at the end. The crack was completely black. There was nothing to see, and yet I stayed longer than made sense, with a feeling in my chest that wasn't exactly fear, but something more like the discomfort of looking at something that should be closed. I closed it and went to sleep. That night I dreamed of my mother. It wasn't a pleasant dream. It was one of those dreams with an oppressive atmosphere that the brain constructs when something worries it. My mother was in the hallway in front of the door of the small room, looking at me with an expression I had never seen in her lifetime. It wasn't fear, it was a warning. She said nothing. She just looked at me. I woke up with that weight on my chest that certain dreams leave behind. I heard my father's steady breathing through the wall and convinced myself that it was just that, a dream. The mind of someone exhausted, processing stress. I convinced myself, more or less. The following days were pure routine. Medications, doctor visits, calls from Marcos promising to arrive soon. It was on a quiet afternoon when I heard the sound for the first time. I was in the living room with the laptop open. My father was sleeping. The silence was complete. And then came a soft creak from the hallway, like a wooden chair shifting slightly under the weight of a body settling in. I froze. It didn't repeat. Silence returned. Then about 30 seconds later, another creak. Exactly the same. I got up and walked to the hallway. The door was ajar. From where I was, I could make out the chair in the center of the room, and the chair was moving. Not much. That minimal and rhythmic rocking that a chair makes when someone who was sitting just got up. I slammed the door open. The room was empty. The chair, still. The stain on the wall, just as always. I stood in the doorway looking inside without entering. I didn't enter. I don't know exactly why. Something in me didn't want to cross that threshold. I closed the door and went to check on my father. He was sleeping peacefully. Regular breathing. That night, while we were having dinner, I tried to approach the topic in another way. "Dad, how long has that chair been in the back room?" He placed the fork on the plate with a care that was too deliberate. "Andres, I asked you not to go into that room." "I didn't enter. I just opened the door." He nodded slightly, as if that were a relative relief. "It belonged to my father," he finally said. "Your grandfather Ernesto." "My grandfather Ernesto had died before I was born. I only knew him from the few photos in the house, and the even scarcer stories my father told about him, always brief. Always with that neutrality we use when talking about someone with whom the relationship was complicated." "And why is he there?" I asked. My father got up from the table. "Because he has always been there," he said. "And he has to stay there." And he went to his room. That night I couldn't sleep. I stayed listening to the house. And at some point, in that state between sleep and wakefulness, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Slow footsteps. Heavy. The kind of footsteps of someone walking with effort, slightly dragging their feet. I sat up in bed. The footsteps stopped in front of my door. The silence that followed had presence. Wait. Then, very slowly, the footsteps continued and stopped, I deduced, in front of the door of the small room. A creak. The sound of a door opening. And then nothing. I sat in the dark with my hand on the lamp switch but didn't turn it on. Finally, I turned it on and stepped into the hallway. Empty. The small room's door was closed. My father was sleeping peacefully. I went back to my room and didn't sleep until it got light outside. The next day I called Marcos. I told him everything. "Andres," he said, "you've been not sleeping well for weeks. The brain does things when it's exhausted. There's a state between asleep and awake where one can hear things that seem completely real." "And the door?" I said. "I close it tightly, and the next day it's ajar." Silence. "Do you want me to go in first?" "No," I said, not exactly knowing why. "I just wanted to tell someone. That afternoon, while my father was taking a nap, I did something I shouldn't have done. I entered the room. The smell was intense from the inside. Confinement, damp wood, something else I couldn't name. Something old and accumulated, like the smell of places that haven't seen people in a long time. The chair, seen up close, was a piece of beautiful antique carpentry. Dark wood, turned legs, high back. An expensive chair for its time. I approached the stain on the wall. Seen up close, it was different from what I imagined. It had an almost three-dimensional texture, layers that hadn't absorbed the paint in the same way. And it had a shape, not a shape that could be precisely described, but not random either. It was the kind of shape that the human eye automatically recognizes as a silhouette. I reached out to touch her. "Andres." My father's voice from the threshold made me jump, almost knocking me to the ground. He was standing there with his cane, looking at me with an expression that was not exactly fear, but was not anything else either. "Get out of there," he said. I left. He closed the door with a firmness that did not correspond to someone in his condition. We went to the living room. He sat down. I sat down in front of him. There was a long silence. "Did you touch the stain?" he asked with an urgency I had never heard before. "No," I said. "Almost, but no." He exhaled slowly. "Good," he said. "Good." And then he told me, "Your grandfather Ernesto was not a good person." He said it without drama, as if stating a historical fact. "When I was a child, he did things in that room. He had dealings with people who came at night, rituals, things that have names but that I prefer not to say out loud in this house." "Witchcraft," I said. My father neither confirmed nor denied it directly. There are people who seek power in ways they shouldn't, and when they find it, they don't find it alone. There is always something on the other side of the deal, something that gives but also takes, and when the person dies, that something doesn't always leave. Did it stay in the room? It stayed in the chair, he said. That's why I never moved it. Someone who knew about these things told me that as long as the chair was in that place, whatever was linked to it couldn't move. That if she took it out, or if someone touched the chair or the stain without knowing what they were doing, the bond would break. And what would happen if it broke? My father looked directly at me. What is in that chair has been waiting for decades to have freedom, he said. I don't want to know what it would do with it. I processed that in silence. The steps I hear at night, I said. The door. I know. Since you arrived, it moves more. Maybe because there are more people in the house. Maybe because it sensed someone was going to enter. Why didn't you tell me before? Because I thought that if I didn't say anything, you wouldn't go. Did Mom know? Something crossed my father's face that lasted only a moment. Your mother knew, he said. She was the one who taught me how to keep it still. She had knowledge that I don't have. I thought about the dream. My mother in the hallway, in front of the door, looking at me with that warning expression. Is there any way to end it definitively? I asked. My father looked at me with that expression he had when he knew something he preferred not to say. The person who knew how to do it was your mother, he said. The weight of that phrase slowly fell upon me. And didn't she teach you? She taught me what was necessary to keep it, and she told me that when the time came, I would know whom to ask to finish the job. That person was going to appear. There was a silence. You appeared, he said. I don't know anything about these things. I know, he said, but you have something. Your mother saw it. That's why I'm telling you. What followed was a strange week. My father was giving me instructions that he had kept for years. Things that my mother had written down in a notebook that he took out from under the mattress with the care one has for something very fragile. The notebook was my mother's, her handwriting, her words. Reading it was like hearing her voice after a long time. The instructions were specific. Certain plants that had to be burned in the room in a specific order. Words that had to be whispered, directed towards the stain on the wall. And finally, the chair. To take it out of the room following an exact path that my mother had traced with lines on a handmade map of the interior of the house. A part of me remained the rational man who explained the concept of hypnagogia to his brother. That part observed what I was doing with distant incredulity. But another part, the one that had heard the footsteps and seen the chair sway and dreamed of my mother in the hallway, followed each instruction with absolute seriousness. I did it one Tuesday night. My father in his room with instructions not to come out no matter what he heard. I entered the small room with the plants lit and the dense white smoke that smelled like something I did not recognize. I stood in front of the stain and said the words softly, with a calmness I didn't entirely feel but maintained because the instructions said that fear was counterproductive. Something changed in the room, not dramatically. There was no spectacular manifestation. What changed was the weight of the air. That density I had felt since I arrived at the house, that thickness that made certain parts of the hallway feel slower, was gone. Little by little, like when one opens a window in a closed room and the airs start to balance out. The stain remained on the wall, but something about it was different. It was just a stain. I took the chair out of the room following the path of my mother's map. To the back door, to the yard, to the back, where my father had wood for the fireplace. I burned it. The fire took longer than usual to catch, as if the wood resisted, but it caught. I watched the flames until there was nothing left. That night I slept like I hadn't slept since I was a child, without dreams, without noises, without that feeling of being watched. My father lived almost 2 more years. They were 2 different years, more peaceful in a way that went beyond the medical. He died in his bed, at peace, with Marcos and me by his side. We sold the house. We left the room empty with the door closed. We didn't tell the buyers anything because there was nothing to say. The chair was no longer there. But sometimes, on nights like that, I think about that house and wonder if I did everything right, if I didn't skip any step without realizing it, if what was in that chair really left with the fire, or if it simply found another way to stay. I have no answer for that. I only know that since that night, the footsteps have not returned. Until now. That was all Andres wanted to share. He wrote to me that he hopes putting it into words serves some purpose. I believe it does. If you ever felt something in a house that you couldn't explain, tell me in the comments. I'm interested in reading it. And if this story accompanied you tonight, subscribe. There are many more testimonies waiting. Take care. We'll hear from each other next time. Have you ever arrived at a place where from the very first moment you felt that it didn't want you there? Not in a hostile or violent way, but in that silent manner, like when you enter a room and something in the air tells you that you don't belong. That was exactly what Isabel felt from the first day she arrived at the sidewalk where she was going to teach. Isabel is 28 years old, she is a teacher, and she wrote to me from a municipality in the south of Colombia just over a month ago. Her message was long, very detailed, and it was clear that she had kept it inside for a long time. If you also have something stored that you would like me to narrate here, write to me. Now, let me tell you what happened to Isabel during the semester she spent living on the edge of the mountain and why she never walked alone after sunset again. I never thought I would end up requesting a transfer before the year was over. When I was assigned to the La Oscurana pathway, I read the name on the paper and felt something I couldn't quite name at that moment. Not exactly fear, more like an unease, like when you pronounce a word that doesn't quite sound right even though you don't know why. La Oscurana. I asked the coordinator of the education department if that was the official name or a nickname. She told me it was the official name, that it had appeared on all maps for over 100 years, and not to worry, that it was a quiet pathway, that the school was small but in good condition, and that the parents were cooperative. I signed the papers. I packed my things. I left. The path was 2 hours from the town center by an unpaved road that the public truck traveled 3 times a week. What wasn't on the papers was that the school was another 20 minutes on foot from where the truck dropped off the passengers, along a horse path that bordered the mountain. I found out when I arrived and asked the driver how to get there. He pointed towards the mountain and said to me, "Take that path. Go straight and don't stray." Those last 4 words he said with an emphasis that didn't match the casual tone of the rest of the directions. He didn't clarify them. He left. The school was exactly as they had described to me. Small, with unpainted block walls, a zinc roof, 2 classrooms, and a small room in the back that served as housing for the teacher. The principal's name was Sophia. She was about 40 years old, had a friendly face, and always busy hands. She welcomed me with coffee and efficiently showed me around, like someone who has already received several city teachers who arrive with scared faces and leave before the first month is over. I asked her how many students there were. She told me 19, from 1st to 5th grade, all in the same classroom with her while I attended to the other group. I asked her how many teachers had passed through that position in recent years. She looked at me for a moment before answering. Some. She didn't add anything else, and I decided not to ask further either. The first week was normal. The children were shy at first but curious, and by the 3rd day, they were already asking me questions that were hard to answer and bringing me fruits and corn that their mothers sent as a welcome. I made the horse path twice a day, morning and afternoon, and the mountains on the sides were dense and green and smelled of damp earth and something floral that I couldn't identify. In the afternoons, when I returned to the village to do the shopping I needed before the store closed, the path felt different under the low light of sunset. The shadows among the trees were deeper. The sounds of the mountains changed register. But I told myself it was just the effect of the hour, that it was natural for a forest path to feel different at night than during the day, and I kept walking. It was the 2nd week when I started to notice the small things. The first was the silence. Not the comfortable silence one associates with the countryside, but a sudden and total silence that fell over the road at certain moments, as if everything living in the woods had decided to fall silent at the same time. Birds, insects, the wind among the leaves, everything cut off abruptly for 30 or 40 seconds, and then gradually resumed. It happened 3 times that week, always in the same stretch of the road, right where a huge tree with exposed roots marked a bend. The second thing was harder to rationalize. One morning upon arriving at school, I found on the entrance step a small figure made of intertwined branches. It was crude but deliberate. It had a human shape, with limbs tied with plant fiber and what seemed to be human hair tangled on top. It wasn't animal hair. It was smooth and dark, the kind that children from the area have. I asked Sophia if she knew what it was. She looked at it for a second with an expression I couldn't quite read, then picked it up and threw it behind the school without saying anything. I pressed her. What was it? She told me, "Things from the woods, don't pay it any mind." That answer seemed insufficient to me, but the tone in which she said it made it clear that I wasn't going to get more information that way. I casually asked the children during a class if they knew which wild animals to be careful of. Several answered, snakes, wasps, the bull from Mr. Fermin's farm. Then a third-grade girl named Paola, who had the most serious eyes I have seen in an 8-year-old, said without anyone asking her directly, "And the goblins." The other children fell silent in a way that did not seem like the normal reaction to a curious answer, but rather something more akin to deference. I asked Paola what she knew about goblins. She told me, "They live in the wild. If you look at them, they follow you home. And they pull the hair of girls with braids." She touched her own braids as she said it. I noticed that all the children had short hair, or it was neatly tied up. That afternoon, on my way back along the horseshoe path, I pushed thoughts of goblins and branch figures into a corner of my mind and told myself they were local legends, part of the area's culture, the kind of stories passed down from generation to generation to keep children close to home. Just like the bogeyman or the man with the sack. Beliefs that didn't deserve me, with my studies in pedagogy and my urban mentality, giving them more weight than they had. But at that very moment, just as I passed by the tree with exposed roots, silence fell. This time it lasted longer, perhaps a full minute, and during that minute, in the woods to my left, about 10 meters among the trees, I heard something I had not heard before, a laugh, not an adult's. It was high-pitched, short, like the laugh of a small child laughing at something private, and it came from deep in the woods, where there was no path and where no child should have been at that hour. I walked faster without running, which was the unspoken instruction that the body gives itself in those moments to not admit that it is afraid. I arrived at the store. I bought what I needed. I returned to school along the path with still enough light to see well. I didn't hear anything else. That night I wrote to my mom in the chat. I asked her if she remembered stories about goblins from when she was a child. She replied with several enthusiastic audio messages about the goblin that supposedly scared a neighbor in the neighborhood when she was 12 years old. It wasn't exactly the information I was looking for, but the sound of her voice helped me sleep. The third week, the dreams started. They were not nightmares in the conventional sense. There were no chases or monsters. It was always the same scenario, the horse path, at night, with a light that had no identifiable source, a kind of gray brightness that covered everything. I walked along that path and knew, with that certainty that only dreams have, that I must not stop. And on the hillside, on both sides, there were presences that I did not see directly but perceived in the periphery, like shadows moving among the trees in rhythm with my steps. I never reached any destination in the dream. I just walked, and the presences followed me. I always woke up before dawn, with the feeling that the room was cold despite the heat outside, and with a smell in the air that took me several days to identify. It was the same floral scent from the path, the one I had not managed to name, but more concentrated, as if someone had entered the room carrying it on their clothes. One day, while checking my hair in the morning, I found a knot. Not the kind that forms when you move while sleeping. It was a deliberate, tight knot in a specific strand, like the one made intentionally with fingers. I untangled it with difficulty. The next day, there was another one in a different strand. I tied my hair up before sleeping. The next morning, the updo was undone, and there were 2 new knots. I went to talk to Sophia. This time she did answer me, but we sat outside under the school's eaves, and she spoke softly even though there was no one nearby. She told me that the goblins of that mountain were something the inhabitants of La Oscurana had known forever, that there were families who had been living alongside them for generations by following certain rules, not entering the mountain after sunset, not imitating their laughter or whistling at them, not looking directly at the trees when movement was heard. She told me that the goblins had a special interest in young women with long hair, that they would pull their hair while they slept as a way of getting attention, and that if one responded to that call, if one sought them out in the mountain instead of ignoring them, things could get complicated. I asked her what it meant to complicate things. She said that they follow you wherever you go, that you start to hear them even when you're not near the mountain, and that if you go into the mountain at night looking for them, sometimes you don't come out. I asked her if she had seen them. She looked me straight in the eyes and said, "I was born here. I learned the rules since I was a child. You arrived 3 weeks ago and they are already noticing you." Then she stood up and walked into the room as if the conversation was over. That same afternoon, as I was leaving school towards the village, I encountered an old man on the road whom I had not seen before. He was sitting on a stone at the edge of the path, wearing a straw hat and with a machete crossed over his knees, looking at the mountains with the expression of someone who has been staring at the same thing for a long time. He greeted me as I passed and called me by my name, even though I had not told him. I asked him how he knew my name. He said, "Everyone knows who the new teacher is." He introduced himself as Don Aurelio. He asked me if I had trouble sleeping. I said yes. He nodded as if he expected it. He told me to stay for a moment and listen to what he wanted to tell me. Don Aurelio told me what no document from the education department mentioned about La Oscurana, that the name came from the first families that settled there, who called it that because the hill bordering the path had a particular darkness even during the day, a density that the light did not fully penetrate. That in that hill lived something that the old people simply called the thing from the hill, which could take the form of animals or small children to approach people, and that had a special appetite for newcomers, for those who did not know the rules. That there was a woman who lived on the edge of the hill, further inside the official path, who was the only person who had learned to speak with that thing from the hill, and that when things got complicated for someone, that woman could help. I asked him who that woman was. Don Aurelio said his name in such a low voice that I barely heard it. Transito. He told me that she wasn't exactly a person from the village, that she had been living on that edge of the mountain for more years than anyone could remember, and that going to see her at night was a bad idea, but that during the day I could find her by following the official path a little beyond where it ended, towards where the trees began to close in. He said that if I wanted things to return to normal, for the knots in my hair and the dreams and the laughter among the trees to stop, it might be worth going. I went to the store, did my shopping, and returned to school. That night the dreams were more intense. The presences in the dream mountain were closer to the path. They no longer just moved among the trees but stopped at the edge, right where the darkness began and the gray light ended, and they looked at me. I couldn't see their faces, only their silhouettes, small, the height of 5 or 6-year-old children, with a rigidity in their posture that was not childish at all. I woke up at 4 in the morning. The room smelled intensely of that mountain perfume. And in the silence of that hour, with complete clarity, I heard from outside the window, just a few meters away, the laughter, the same as on the path. Sharp, short, repeated twice. I remained motionless in bed until dawn. The next day, a Saturday, there were no classes. I told Sophia that I was going to walk along the path for a while. She asked me how far. I told her maybe as far as the official path went. She looked at me for a second and said, "Are you going to look for Transito?" I said maybe. She nodded with a slowness that seemed resigned to me. She said, "Go in the morning, before noon, and don't accept anything to eat or drink that she offers you." I thanked her. She didn't say anything else. I left at 8 in the morning. The path was bathed in light and the birds sounded normal and the forest smelled of wet earth from the previous night's rain. I told myself it was a beautiful place, that under normal circumstances I would be one of those walkers who seek exactly this, silence and green and clean air. I passed the tree with exposed roots. There was no sudden silence. I continued. Beyond where the official road ended, there was a narrow, barely marked path that led into the trees. I followed it for 10 minutes, with light filtering through the foliage in slanted rays that made the space within the woods brighter than I would have expected. And then I saw the cabin. It was small, made of dark wood, with a roof covered in moss. It had a narrow porch with a couple of dry leather chairs. And in one of those chairs, as if she had been waiting for me, sat a woman. She was very old. One of those old ages that have no precise age, that could be 80 years or 120. She had white hair tied in braids, which seemed significant to me, although I couldn't say why. Her eyes were a light color that didn't match the dark tone of her skin, a color between gray and green that the mountain light made strange. She looked at me with the same expression as Don Aurelio by the roadside, without surprise. She said to me, "Isabel." Not as a question, but as a confirmation. I said yes. I told her that I had been told she could help me. She indicated for me to sit in the other chair. I remembered what Sophia had told me, and when she moved inside the ranch, I assumed to bring something. I told her I didn't want anything, that I had had breakfast. She returned without bringing anything, sat down, and asked me what I had seen and heard. I told her everything. The silences along the way, the figure of branches, The laughter among the trees, the knots in the hair, the dreams, the laughter outside the window. She listened without interrupting me, with her hands on her knees and her eyes somewhere between my eyes and the mountain behind me. When I finished, she remained silent for a while that felt long to me. Then she told me that the mountain had already marked me, that when something from the mountain marks someone, especially a newcomer, that person either needs to leave or someone needs to negotiate for them. That leaving without doing anything meant taking them along, that they didn't stay in the mountain but continued on, that in the city they were confused with dreams or stress or mental health issues but that they didn't leave, and that staying without doing anything wasn't an option either because the interest increased over time. I asked her what negotiating entailed. She explained to me with the patience of someone who has explained the same thing many times, that the mountain was not evil in the sense that people understood it, that it did not want to harm her but functioned as a sustained attention, like when a wild animal gets used to a person and starts to follow them, that the negotiation was simple. I had to leave something at the edge of the mountain, something that was mine, something personal, and that served as a boundary, as a way of telling it that this was where my space ended and to respect that edge, that she would accompany me to the tree with exposed roots, which was the point where the mountain had started to notice me, and that I had to leave the object without looking towards the mountain while doing so. I asked her what kind of object. She said, something that you use close to your body, that has your scent. I was wearing a thread bracelet that my mom had given me when I graduated from university. I had worn it without taking it off for 4 years. I showed her the bracelet. Transito looked at it and nodded. We walked back together along the path to the official road. She walked with a dark wooden cane and a pace that was not slow but also not what I would have expected from someone her age. We didn't talk during the journey. When we reached the tree with exposed roots, she stopped a few meters from the tree and indicated for me to approach alone. She said quietly, "Place the bracelet on a root. Don't look towards the mountain, and don't say anything while you do it." I approached the tree. The smell of the mountain was intense there, that mix of damp and floral that I already knew well. I crouched down and placed the bracelet on a root that stuck out of the ground like an arch. The earth beneath was soft and dark. I kept my eyes on my hands and on the root and on the earth. I didn't look towards the mountain, but I listened. It was the first silence, the usual one, that total cutoff. And then, during that silence, something approached. I didn't see it. I only heard it. Footsteps on the dry leaves of the forest floor. Light, irregular, like someone who doesn't weigh much. They stopped a few meters from where I was, and there was a breath, barely audible, curious. I got up. I walked back to Transito without running, with all the calm I could muster. She looked at me when I reached her side and said, "Good." We started walking back to school. There was no sudden silence during that journey. The birds sounded all the way. That night I slept differently, deeply, without dreams. Or if there were any, I don't remember them. The room didn't smell of anything strange. In the morning, I checked my hair. No tangles. A week passed, then another. The bridle path was just a path. The mountain on the sides was just a mountain. The children continued to take care of their hair. The mothers kept sending fruits as a thank you. And Sophia would occasionally look at me with an expression that I learned to interpret as, "Is everything okay?" To which I would respond by nodding. I didn't go looking for Transito again. I don't know if that was the right thing to do. Sometimes I think I should have asked her more questions. That there were things she knew that she didn't tell me because I didn't ask them. Who she was exactly. How long she had been on that edge of the mountain. What she had negotiated herself to stay there all those years without anything from the mountain bothering her. At the end of that semester I requested the transfer. Not out of fear, or not just because of that. It was because La Oscurana demanded a type of attention and an adaptation that I wasn't sure I could sustain. There are people who are born in those places and learn their rules from childhood and carry them in their bodies naturally. I was not that person, and it's better to recognize it in time than to stay until something you don't fully understand decides that it has spent enough time watching. My transfer was approved for the following academic year. The last time I walked along the horseshoe path, I looked at the tree with exposed roots as I passed. The bracelet was no longer there. I suppose the water or the wind took it, or some animal found it, or maybe something else took it away. I don't want to know which of the 3 options is correct. That's all I can tell, or all I'm willing to share for now. And there ends Isabel's testimony. She wrote to me at the end of the message that she still misses the children from La Oscurana, especially Paula, the one with the serious eyes who knew more than an 8-year-old should know. What stays with me the most from her story is that image of something from the woods that simply notices you without malice, like an attention that no one asked for and doesn't know how to turn off by itself. If you know stories from your region about goblins, entities from the woods, or places with rules that no one wrote but everyone respects, tell me about them in the comments. I love it when you share that kind of tales. Have a peaceful night. And if you live near a forest, don't look between the trees when you hear movement. We'll talk soon. What I am about to tell you now was sent to me by a listener named Isabel. She wrote to me that she experienced this when she was 23 years old, that almost 8 years have passed since then, and that there are still nights when she wakes up with the smell in her nose. Just the smell, she told me, and that is enough for her not to be able to fall back asleep. If you also have something that haunts you like this, something that doesn't completely fade away with time, write to me. Sometimes it helps to have someone else listen. Isabel's story took place in a mountain village where she spent a summer working as a camp counselor, and it has to do with a forest that the locals knew very well, and with a very specific rule that everyone followed without questioning it: never enter the forest after dark. The job of camp monitor was not what I had planned for that summer, but when the scholarship I was hoping for didn't come through and my bank account started to speak louder than my plans, I accepted the offer without thinking too much. 3 months in a summer camp for children aged 8 to 12, in a mountain village called Fuente Oscura, with accommodation included, and a salary that wasn't generous, but was enough. I left in June with my backpack and the practical disposition of someone who has learned to adapt to what is available. Fuente Oscura was exactly the kind of village that the name suggested. Small, nestled between 2 wooded slopes, with a narrow river running through the center and a square with its church and 4 stone benches. Most of its permanent inhabitants were elderly people. The young people had left for the cities years ago, as happens in so many villages, and what remained was that specific mix of stillness and memory that places have when they have seen several generations depart. The camp was on the outskirts, in a clearing between the village and the forest. Wooden cabins, a large dining room, an activity area, a small pool. The kind of functional facility that has no aesthetic pretensions but perfectly fulfills its purpose. There were 6 monitors in total and a director named Graciela, a woman in her 40s with that quiet efficiency of someone who has organized these things many times and already has a protocol for everything. The first meeting with Graciela, before the children arrived, included a review of the camp's operating rules, schedules, safety protocols, activity organization, emergency procedures, all reasonable, all expected. And at the end, almost as a casual addition, Graciela said, "One more thing. The forest to the north of the camp. The children are not to enter there under any circumstances at any time, and the monitors are not to enter after dark." One of the other monitors, a guy named Felix, who had been at the camp for 2 summers, nodded as if he already knew. The rest of us exchanged brief glances. "Why?" I asked. Graciela looked at me with an expression that was not annoyance but something more akin to the assessment of someone measuring whether the question came from genuine curiosity or from a tendency to question the rules on principle. "Because the terrain is uneven and not marked," she said, "because there are uncovered water wells in some areas, and because at night it's easy to get disoriented and the village is far away." These were perfectly sensible reasons. I accepted them. But Felix, later that same afternoon, when we were alone preparing the cabins, told me something different. "The reasons Graciela gave are true," he said to me, "but they are not all the reasons." Felix was 26 years old and was from a town similar to Fuente Oscura, from that mountainous area, which meant he had grown up with a certain type of knowledge about the forests that city people do not have. Not theoretical knowledge, but the practical and intuitive knowledge of someone who has lived close to them since childhood and has learned to treat them with respect without needing anyone to explain exactly why. He told me, while we spread sheets over bunk beds, that the forest to the north of the camp had a reputation in the village, long before any of the current inhabitants could remember. Not a specific fame, with concrete stories and dates and names, rather a diffuse fame. The kind that accumulates in places over generations until no one knows where it started, but everyone knows it exists. The people of the village didn't use that forest. There was another forest to the south where they did walk, where they picked mushrooms in the fall, where the children played. The one to the north they left alone. Why specifically? I asked him. Felix shrugged. There are stories, he said, of people who entered at night and didn't come back or came back different. The kind of stories that have been told in villages forever and that no one knows if they are true or have been exaggerated over time. He looked at me. But those who live here don't go in, and they haven't for generations. And when someone has been respecting something for generations without questioning it, I prefer to respect that too. It was a logic that I understood, although at that moment, the skeptical part of me registered it as local superstition and filed it in the category of interesting but not necessarily significant things. That category gradually emptied throughout the summer. The first groups of children arrived, and the camp fell into that intense and noisy rhythm that is its natural state. Activities, meals, controlled excursions, the small daily crises of coexistence among children of different ages. There was no time to think too much about the northern forest, which remained there, at the back of the campgrounds, with its line of dark trees that from the clearing looked like a green wall with no apparent depth. But there was something in that forest that I noticed every time I looked at it directly. It was hard to articulate. It wasn't exactly that it looked different from normal forests. It was more a matter of silence. The other forests in the area, the southern one where we had authorized excursions, had sounds. Birds, wind among the leaves, the small noises of animal life. The northern forest from the outside, from the camp clearing, always seemed to be silent. Not the silence of a quiet place. The silence of a place where things stay still when someone looks. I mentioned it to Felix one afternoon. He nodded without surprise. Yes, he said. I noticed it too the first summer. I no longer notice it because I have gotten used to it, but it is still there. The incident that changed everything happened in mid-July, with the second shift of children already settled in. That night I was on duty. Duty meant staying awake until 1 in the morning, making a round through the cabins to ensure that all the children were in their beds and nothing required attention, and then sleeping in the counselor's cabin with the phone next to the bed in case something happened. I made the 11 o'clock round without incident. I made the 12 o'clock round also without incident. It was a quiet night, with a nearly full moon illuminating the clearing with that silvery clarity that makes nighttime places look simultaneously more and less real than during the day. I went to do the 1 o'clock round, and in cabin 7 a girl was missing. The girl's name was Sophia. She was 9 years old, and she was one of those girls who during the day were pure energy and who at night slept so deeply that her cabin mates complained that she snored. She was not the type of girl who would get up alone at night. But her bed was empty and the cabin door was ajar. I checked the bathrooms first. Empty. I checked the activity area. Nothing. I woke Felix, who was the other monitor on duty that night, and while he checked the dining room and the other facilities, I approached the edge of the esplanade, and I saw Sophia. She was standing at the edge of the camp, exactly where the illuminated ground ended and the darkness of the northern forest began. She was in a nightgown, barefoot, with her arms at her sides, looking towards the trees with a stillness that was not the stillness of a girl asleep on her feet. It was the stillness of someone who is completely attentive to something. Sophia, I said, walking towards her quietly so as not to scare her. She did not respond. She did not move. I got closer. I reached her, put a hand on her shoulder, and she turned to me with an expression that at that moment I did not know how to classify and that only later, thinking about it, I understood was the expression of someone who has just been interrupted in the middle of something. What are you doing here? I asked her in a low voice. Sophia looked at me. Her eyes were wide awake. I was listening, she said. Listening to what? She pointed towards the forest. The music, she said. I didn't hear any music. I listened for a long moment with all the attention I could muster, and all there was the silence of the northern forest and the distant sound of the river and the gentle wind among the southern trees. There's no music, Sophia, I said. She looked at me like children do when adults say something that is obviously incorrect to them, but they don't want to be disrespectful. There is, she said. I've been listening to it for a while from the cabin. That's why I came out. I took her back to her cabin. She fell asleep in less than 5 minutes, as if nothing had happened. I sat on the edge of her bed for a while, looking at the closed door, thinking about what she had said. When I left, Felix was waiting for me outside. I told him what Sophia had said, the music that I hadn't heard. the way she had been standing at the edge of the forest. Felix didn't speak for a moment. Was she looking in or out? He asked. In, I said. Towards the trees. Felix nodded slowly. I'll tell Graziella something tomorrow, he said. And let's not let the kids go near the northern edge of the property, not even during the day. The next day, Graziella listened to what we told her with the same calm, evaluative expression she had for everything. When we finished speaking, she paused for a moment in silence and then said, Sophia was sleepwalking. It's not unusual in children her age, especially in new environments. We will note it and inform her parents so they are aware. It was a reasonable medical explanation. But then, as Felix and I were leaving, Graziella said something else. Isabel. I turned to her. The rules about the forest also apply to monitors outside of hours, especially at night. I understand that you were doing your job when you approached the boundary to look for the girl. But in the future, if something like this happens again, wake up another monitor before approaching alone. I looked at her. Why? I asked. Graziella held my gaze. Because two people are harder to confuse than one, she said. And she didn't explain what she meant by that. That night, after the children fell asleep and the camp fell silent, I went out to the clearing with a cup of tea and sat on one of the wooden benches that faced the northern forest. I had no intention of going in. I am neither foolish nor reckless. I just wanted to sit and watch and see if I heard anything that Sophia might have called music. I was there for about 20 minutes. The forest remained in its characteristic silence, that silence that had its own texture, different from the silence of the other forests I knew. The moon was high and clear, and the line of trees was sharply defined, each trunk distinguishable, each branch. It was then that I saw them, not inside the forest, at the edge, among the first trees, just where the moonlight still reached before the darkness of the interior absorbed everything. They were small. I couldn't give an exact height, but the impression I had was of something low, about the height of a 4 or 5-year-old child, although the shape was not that of a child. It was more compact, more horizontal in a way. Even though it was standing, there were several. I couldn't tell exactly how many because they moved slowly between the first trunks, from side to side, and the light was not enough to count them with certainty. 3, maybe 4. They made no noise. I remained absolutely still on the bench, with the cup of tea in my hands, not taking my eyes off that line of trees. And while I was watching them, one of them stopped, and turned towards where I was. I can't describe a face because I didn't see a face. What I saw was a direction, the unmistakable feeling that something that had been moving without paying me any attention suddenly was giving me its full attention, and with that attention came something more. Not a sound, not exactly, but something that I perceived as if it were a sound, even though it didn't pass through my ears. A cadence, a rhythm, something that if I had to name it with the closest word I have, I would have called it music, even though it resembled no music I had ever heard before or since. It lasted a few seconds. Then it turned again, and I saw them move away into the forest until darkness absorbed them. I got up. I entered the dining room. I sat under the fluorescent light and stayed there until dawn. I didn't tell anyone what I had seen that night. Not Felix, not Graziella, not the other monitors. There was something about the experience that I didn't want to turn into conversation yet, as if talking about it would change something in the way I had kept it. But I observed more. In the following nights, from the window of my cabin facing north, I looked at the edge of the forest, and 2 more times, on clear moonlit nights, I saw movement among the first trees, always late, always near the edge, never coming out into the clearing but also not completely inside. I never heard the music again, or maybe I did hear it but learned not to pay attention to it in the same way, to treat it as Felix had described he did with silence, to get used to it without forgetting that it was there. On the last night of the last shift, when the children had left and we were finishing cleaning the facilities to close the camp until the following year, Felix and I sat on the esplanade with a bottle of cheap wine and talked about what we had experienced that summer. I told him what I had seen that night, for the first time. He listened to the end without interrupting. What do you think they were? I asked him when I finished. Felix took his time. In the villages of this area, he said, old people have different names for what lives in the forests, different explanations about where they come from and what they want. He took a sip. But what all the names and all the explanations have in common is this. They are not from here, in the sense that they are not from the side of the world where we are. They are on the edge. And what they do on that edge, we do not do. They do it. And the music? I said. The music is the way they call, he said. Not to everyone. To some. To those who can hear it. I thought of Sophia, barefoot in her nightshirt, standing at the edge of the trees. And what if someone enters? I asked. Into the forest, at night, following the music. Felix looked at me. I don't know for sure, he said. But the stories told in the villages about people who entered and did not return or returned different. He fell silent for a moment. Those who returned different took time to recognize their own family. They looked at familiar places as if they were new, as if they had been in another place for a long time, even though physically they had only spent hours. The silence that followed was long and filled with things neither of them said. I returned to the city in September. I resumed my studies, my life, my routines. The camp was left behind in the way that summer jobs are left behind, with that effect of distance that time produces on intense experiences. But Felix was right about something he told me that last night, when we were already picking up the bottle and getting ready to sleep. What you saw, he said, does not disappear completely. Not for those who can see it. It's like learning to distinguish a sound that was always there, but that you didn't know how to listen to before. Once you hear it, you can't unhear it. He was right. Almost 8 years have passed. I live in a big city, work in an office, and lead a perfectly normal life in every verifiable sense. But there are nights, especially in summer, when the moon is high and there is enough silence, when I wake up with that smell in my nose. The smell of the northern forest. That specific mix of damp earth and resin and something older that has no precise name. And sometimes, on the edge between being asleep and being awake, I think I hear something that if I had to name it with the closest word I have, I would call music. In those moments, I get up. I turn on the light. I sit in the kitchen until dawn comes through the window. I have never returned to Fuente Oscura. But sometimes I think of Sophia, that 9-year-old girl barefoot in the dark, completely still, listening. And I wonder if she remembers that night. And if she also experiences the same thing as me in certain summers. I hope not. I hope that for her it has remained just an episode of sleepwalking, nothing more. But sometimes I don't believe that. That's all I have to share. And that's where Isabel's story ends. She wrote to me that she has never sought information about Fuente Oscura or the forests in that area, that she has consciously decided not to do so. I understand that decision. There are answers that change nothing in practice, and only add weight to something that is already heavy enough. What stayed with me the most from this story is that image of the girl at the edge of the forest, listening to something that others could not hear. If you grew up in a town with a place like that, a forest, a hill, a path that no one used without anyone fully explaining why, I would love for you to share it with me in the comments. Those collective stories are what build this space. Take care tonight. We'll hear from each other next time. A follower who prefers to remain anonymous sent me this story a few days ago. They told me they had never shared it with anyone, that for years they thought that if they put it into words, it would become more real than it already was. In the end, they decided to write it down. And I decided to share it with you because there is something about this tale that feels different from the others. Closer. Harder to ignore. If you also have a hidden experience that no one has heard, the comments are open. This is a space for that. But now, let me take you to an old house in a rural town on a stormy night, and to a pact that someone signed long before our narrator was born. I was 11 years old when I first saw the woman in the mirror. I didn't understand it that way at the time. At 11, one doesn't have the vocabulary to name certain things, and even if I did, I'm not sure it would have made a difference. There are experiences that language cannot reach, that remain floating somewhere between what happened and what one is able to process. For years I kept it there, in that nameless space, and tried to live as if it didn't exist. But it does exist. And what happened afterward, 20 years later, forced me to unearth it all. My name is Marcos. I grew up in my maternal grandparents' house, in a rural town that I will not name because there are people who still live there and it is not my place to drag it into their lives. It was a quiet town, One of those where everyone knows each other and where secrets do not disappear but become part of the landscape, so familiar that they cease to be seen. My grandparents' house was large by the town's standards. 2 stories, thick stone walls, a backyard where my grandmother grew herbs and flowers. It was an old house. My grandfather Bernardo used to say he was over 150 years old, although I never knew if it was true or if it was the kind of thing old people exaggerate to give weight to things. What was certainly true was that the house had that particular quality of places that have absorbed a lot of time. Creaks that didn't correspond to any movement, drafts that appeared without open windows, a temperature in certain rooms that never matched the rest of the house no matter how much heating there was. I loved him. As a child, that house was the best place in the world. The mirror was in the back room, on the 2nd floor. It wasn't a room that was used regularly. It had a bed, an old wardrobe, and that mirror, which took up almost the entire wall opposite the door. It was a full-length mirror with a dark carved wooden frame, with motifs that as a child I thought were flowers, but that as an adult I recognized as something else. Intertwined figures that could be human if you looked at them a certain way, or could be something else if you looked at them another way. My grandmother Rosa had a rule about that room. No one slept there. She never explained why. When I asked, she said the bed was uncomfortable, that the room was cold, that there were better places in the house to rest. She always had a different reason, and none were the true one. I discovered it one August night when I was 11, and my cousins had come to stay for a few days. We were 4 kids in a house with enough rooms for everyone, but that night, for some reason I no longer remember, we decided it would be fun to all sleep together in the back room. The forbidden room. The room of the mirror. My grandparents were already asleep. It was late, close to midnight. My cousins fell asleep quickly, like kids do when they're tired from a day of play. I took longer. I lay in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, listening to the breathing of the others, and at some point, I turned my head and looked at the mirror. There was moonlight that night, and enough light came in through the window without curtains for the mirror not to be completely black. You could see something. The outline of the room reflected the sleeping shapes of my cousins, and me, lying there, watching. At first, I didn't see anything different, just the normal reflection. But after a while, that long and vague stretch of sleepless childhood nights, I noticed something. In the reflection, the room looked the same but not exactly the same. It was like when you copy a drawing by hand and almost get it right, but there's something in the proportions that doesn't quite fit. The mirrored room had the same furniture, the same sleeping shapes, the same moonlight, but the shadows fell differently, not at the angle they should have given where the window was, but from another direction, as if in the mirrored room the moon were in another part of the sky, and there was someone standing by the door. In the reflection, only in the reflection. A tall woman figure, completely still. I couldn't see her clearly because she was in the darkest part of the reflection, but the shape was unmistakable. Someone standing by the door, looking toward where I was lying. I turned my head toward the real door. There was no one. I looked back at the mirror. The figure was still there. What I felt wasn't exactly fear, or not just fear. It was something more akin to vertigo, to that physical sensation of the ground moving beneath your feet, as if something in reality had taken a small misstep and took time to readjust. I covered myself with the sheet up to my head, closed my eyes, and didn't open them until I saw daylight filtering through the fabric. I didn't tell anyone, not my cousins, nor my grandparents. I kept it with that particular efficiency of children to bury things they cannot process. Years went by. I grew up, stopped spending summers at my grandparents' house, went to the city to study, built my adult life with the deliberate distance one sometimes places between oneself and the places of childhood. My grandfather Bernardo died when I was 23. My grandmother Rosa continued living in the house, alone, with the quiet stubbornness of old people who do not want to change their geography. I visited her every once in a while, not frequently, and I never went up to the 2nd floor if I could avoid it. What happened 2 years ago started in a completely ordinary way. My grandmother Rosa had a fall. Nothing serious, a fracture in her right wrist that required minor surgery and several weeks of recovery. She couldn't be alone in that big house, and my uncles had their complicated lives, so I was the one who offered to stay with her during the month that the recovery lasted. I returned to my grandparents' house at 31 years old with a suitcase. My grandmother settled me into my usual room on the first floor, and the first nights were quiet. It was November, the town was silent and cold, and there was something restorative in that slow rhythm of the days with an elderly person. Breakfast at 8, the news at noon, the usual soup at 7 in the evening. It was during the first week that I began to notice my grandmother looking at the ceiling, not constantly, but now and then, at random moments during the day, in the middle of a conversation, while waiting for the water to boil, while watching television. She would raise her gaze to the ceiling or to the stairs with an expression that I couldn't read immediately. One day I asked her, "Grandma, what are you looking at?" She lowered her eyes and smiled, that calm smile of hers. "Nothing, dear. Old lady's quirks." But the third time I saw her do it, I noticed the exact direction of her gaze. I didn't look at the ceiling in general. I looked at a specific point, the ceiling above the stairs, which corresponded to the floor of the back room, on the second floor, the mirror room. That night, when she was already asleep, I went up. I hadn't been in that room since that childhood night. When I opened the door, the smell hit me first. Old wood, something like incense, although there was no incense, and beneath all that, something that had no name, but that I immediately recognized from somewhere below consciousness. The room was the same bed, the same wardrobe, the same mirror occupying almost the entire back wall. The November moon entered through the window with that cold and precise light of winter, and the mirror faintly shone in the darkness. I stood in the doorway for a moment. I didn't enter. From where I was, I could see my own reflection in the mirror. Me, standing in the doorway, with the hallway light behind. Nothing more. I went to sleep. But that night I dreamed of the mirror. In the dream, I was standing in front of it, and my reflection did not mimic me. My reflection was still while I moved, watching me with an expression that was not mine. And at one moment it opened its mouth and said something I did not get to hear because I woke up suddenly with my heart racing and the room of my childhood wrapped in familiar darkness. I sat up in bed and waited for my heart to calm down. And then I heard it. From above. From the back room. A soft, almost imperceptible sound that took me several seconds to identify. It was like the brushing of something against a glass surface. Slow, rhythmic, as if someone from the other side of the mirror was running their fingers along the surface. I remained completely still, listening. The sound continued for perhaps 2 minutes, and then it stopped. Absolute silence. I did not go up that night. I stayed sitting on the bed until dawn, and when light finally started coming in through the window, I breathed and decided that I would talk to my grandmother. Breakfast was normal. She was in a good mood, happy to have company, asking me about my job and my life in the city. I let her talk, and when there was a natural silence, I asked her, "Grandma, what's in the mirror in the upstairs room?" The silence that followed was different from normal silences. It was a silence with weight. My grandmother Rosa carefully set the cup down on the table, as if she needed to do something with her hands to think. Then she looked at me with those small brown eyes of hers that had always seemed indecipherable to me. "Did you go up to the room?" she asked. "Only to the door." "Did you see anything?" "I heard something last night." She nodded slowly, as if that was what she had feared, and at the same time what she had hoped for somewhere. "Sit down," she said, even though I was already sitting. It was a way of saying, "What I am going to tell you requires you to be still," and he told me. The story was over 60 years old. My grandmother had kept it all that time, first because there were no words to tell it, and then because the words existed but the fear was greater than them. When my grandmother Rosa was 19 years old and had just married my grandfather Bernardo, they lived in that same house that had belonged to his family for generations. In the first year of marriage, my grandmother became pregnant. And in the 6th month, something went wrong. There was no doctor close enough. There was nothing close enough. That night, alone with my grandfather in that village house, my grandmother lost the baby. What followed were dark months. The depression, the silence, the distance that sometimes settles between two people after a loss that neither knows how to name. And one winter night, my grandmother went up to the back room because it was the farthest from my grandfather's bedroom, and she wanted to cry without him hearing her. She sat in front of the mirror in the darkness, and without any intention, without any ritual, without knowing what she was doing, she spoke to the mirror. She spoke to her dead baby. She asked to see him. Just once. Just to know that he was okay, that he was somewhere, and that he hadn't simply vanished into nothingness. And the mirror answered her. It didn't show her the baby. My grandmother was very clear about that when she told me, with the precision of someone who has relived a memory so many times that she knows every detail. What appeared in the mirror was not her son. It was a woman who was not in the room, only in the reflection, standing behind where my grandmother was sitting. And that woman spoke to her. She told her that she could help her, that she could make the next pregnancy come to term, that she could protect the baby that would come. My grandmother, at 19 years old and with a broken heart, asked what she wanted in return. The answer was this: nothing of yours. Just leave the mirror where it is and don't cover it and don't take it out of the house. That was all. No blood, no complicated promises, no rituals, just that. My grandmother said yes. The following pregnancy came to term. My mother was born healthy, and then 2 more children came, also healthy. My grandmother fulfilled her part of the deal with the simplicity of someone paying a debt that seems fair. She left the mirror where it was, never covered it, never took it out of the house. But over the years, she began to notice things. The mirror not only reflected the room. Sometimes, at certain moments, at certain hours, it showed things that were not there. Not always the figure of the woman. Sometimes just shadows with the wrong fall. Sometimes the room empty but with the feeling that someone had just been there. And sometimes, very rarely, the woman again, standing in the reflection, looking outside. "Did it ever hurt you?" I asked her. "Never," my grandmother said. "In all these years, never." She paused. "As long as the mirror is there, it fulfills its part. It left us in peace." "But," I said, because there was a but in her voice even if she hadn't said it. She clasped her hands on the table. "Lately she has been more active. I hear her. You heard her last night. Before, months could go by without me noticing anything, sometimes years. But for the past few months, there are nights when she makes a sound. And I am no longer young Marcos." She looked at me. "I'm starting to think that when I'm gone, someone else will have to know what's in that room, so they don't make the mistake of taking out the mirror or covering it or doing something that breaks the agreement." What I felt at that moment was a mix of things that are hard to separate. Fear, yes, but also something more complicated. The understanding that that childhood night, what I saw in the mirror was real, that I hadn't imagined it, that I had spent 20 years carrying that nameless image and it turned out it had a name, it had a history, it had context. "What is it?" I asked. "What lives in that mirror?" My grandmother shook her head. "I never asked. When you're 19 and you're shattered and something offers you what you desire most, you don't ask what it is, you accept. And what if I asked it now?" She looked at me for a long moment. "I don't know. But if you decide to go up to that room, Marcos, you need to know one thing. Don't make any deals. Whatever it says, whatever it offers, don't accept anything. The deal I made was small and has been working for decades because it was small. A new deal with that thing, I don't know what it would entail. That night I didn't go up. But the next night I did. It was around 1 in the morning when I woke up again to the sound of that rubbing against the glass, this time longer, more insistent, as if something had decided that my patience had run out. I got up, climbed the stairs in the dark, and opened the door to the back room. The November moon filled the room with its cold light, and the mirror shone like a window into a place with different lighting. I stood in the doorway like the night before, and looked at my reflection. My reflection looked back at me. For almost a minute, just that. Silence. The room still, the mirror showing exactly what it should show. And then, in the reflection, I saw that something was changing behind me. I didn't turn my head. Something in me knew it without having to verify it. There was nothing behind me in the actual room. What I saw was only in the reflection. And what the reflection showed me was the figure of a woman materializing in the darkness at the back, taking shape like when the eyes adjust to the dim light, and the shapes that were once nothing become something. I saw her clearly for the first time. She was a middle-aged woman, or at least she seemed to be. Slim, with dark hair tied up, dressed in something that did not correspond to any particular era, or perhaps corresponded to all. Her face was completely ordinary, and that was the most disturbing part. There was nothing monstrous about her. It was a normal face, with dark eyes and an expression that could be described, if one had to choose a word, as patient. She spoke. I heard her not with my ears, but in the same way that sometimes one's own thoughts appear in the mind without being invited. You haven't been here in a long time. I don't live here, I said. Your grandmother is getting old. I know. When she is no longer here, the agreement will need someone to uphold it. I remembered what my grandmother had warned me. Don't make any deals. I'm just here to take care of her while she recovers, I said. After that, I go back to the city. You can go back to the city. The agreement does not require you to be here. It only requires that the mirror remains. What if I sell the house when my grandmother dies? It was more of a thought than a question, but I said it out loud. The figure in the reflection did not change its expression. The mirror can go with the house. As long as it remains in this world, the agreement holds. What if it breaks? What if there's an accident? That would be a problem for everyone. The "for everyone" hung in the cold air of the room with a particular weight. What would happen? Nothing that hasn't happened before in places where agreements are broken. I didn't respond to that. I kept staring at its reflection for a moment, and then asked something I hadn't planned to ask, but that came out on its own. What are you? For the first time since the conversation had started, something in the figure changed. Not in its expression, but in the quality of its stillness, like when a person who is pretending indifference slightly tenses a muscle. I am what remains when the deal was big enough. I didn't completely understand that. I still don't understand it. But there was something in that answer that seemed to me, in a strange way, honest. What do you want from me tonight? I asked. If it's not a deal, what is it? Just so you know, that when she is no longer here, you know. Not so that you do anything. Just so you know and don't make a mistake out of ignorance. I remained silent. The mirror cannot leave this house. It cannot be covered. It cannot be destroyed. If any of those three things happen, the agreement is broken, and what the agreement has kept contained for 60 years will no longer be contained. What has been kept contained? He didn't answer that. You? I insisted. Me? And what is behind me? What is behind me? I didn't want to ask what was behind her. There was something in that phrase that closed that question in a way that I preferred to respect. All right, I finally said. I understand the conditions. Do you accept them? I am not accepting any deal, I said, remembering my grandmother's warning. I'm just acknowledging that they exist, and that I've heard them. There was a silence that felt like evaluation. That's enough for now. And the figure dissolved into the reflection with the same gradualness with which it had appeared. The mirror showed only the empty room again, the moon coming in through the window, my own reflection standing in the doorway. I went down, got into bed, and this time I did sleep. The rest of the month went by without further incidents. My grandmother recovered well, regained the movement in her wrist, and returned to her routine. We didn't talk much more about the mirror. There wasn't much more to say. The last night before returning to the city, she found me in the garden where I was smoking, and stood by my side looking at the stars for a moment before speaking. Did you talk to her? She asked. Yes. Did you make any deal? No. My grandmother nodded slowly with something that could have been relief. Good. She paused. When I'm gone, the house will be yours. You don't have to live in it. But don't sell it without making sure the mirror goes with it. And tell the buyer that that room isn't used, that the bed is uncomfortable, that it's cold. She looked at me with a small smile. I know how long we've been telling people that. I laughed. It was a strange laugh, a bit forced, but real. How much longer do you think this can be kept up? I asked her. She thought for a moment. The time it takes, I suppose. He shrugged with that calmness of someone who has had decades to make peace with something. Deals don't have an expiration date. They either hold or break. My grandmother Rosa died 8 months ago, peacefully, in her bed, without drama, as she had lived. The house passed to me. The mirror is still in the back room. I go to the village once a month, open the house, check that everything is fine, go up to the second floor, and peek into the room for a moment. The mirror reflects the empty room, the light from the window, my own reflection in the door. The figure hasn't appeared since that night. But the mirror, when I look at it from certain angles, at certain times of the day, still shows shadows with the wrong fall. And I still haven't sold the house. This is where what this follower wanted to share ends. He told me that writing it was harder than he expected, not because of fear, but because he had to accept that for 30 years, he lived with something he couldn't see. that sometimes the most disturbing stories are not those of monsters, but those of agreements made out of necessity, which pass from generation to generation without anyone having fully chosen them. If this story resonated with you, let me know in the comments. And if you also have something hidden that no one has heard, you know there's a place for that here. Take care. We'll hear from each other in the next story. A few weeks ago, I received a long, very long message from a follower of the channel. Her name is Valentina. She is 34 years old and currently lives in Bogota, although the story she shared with me took place in the town where she grew up, a small place in the mountains that she never wanted to name exactly. She told me that she wrote it all in one go, without stopping, because she needed to get it out before it swallowed her whole. Before I take you to what Valentina experienced, if you have an experience that has haunted you and you want me to share it here, leave it in the comments or write to me. Sometimes telling is the only way to let go. Now let me take you to the summer when Valentina returned to her childhood town and discovered that there are inheritances that no one chooses, but that still come to collect. I was 7 years old the last time I saw my grandmother alive. I don't remember her clearly, in that vivid way one remembers things they love. I remember her more like one remembers a disturbing dream, in fragments, in sensations, in the smell of bitter grass that came from her room and that I never quite knew how to name. I remember her hands, long and dark, always busy with something I couldn't see. I remember that the people of the town respected her, but not in the way one feels for wise elders. It was another kind of respect, the kind that comes from fear. My mother took my cousin Lucia and me away from that town when my grandmother died. There was no wake that we attended, nor a burial that they took us to. One day my mother simply packed our bags with an efficiency that seemed strange to me even at that age, and we left for the city. We never returned. For years I asked about the town, about the house, about what we had left behind, and my mother always found a way to steer the conversation elsewhere. Over time, I stopped asking. I grew up. I studied graphic design. I got clients, a small apartment, an orderly life. So, last year, my mother died. It wasn't sudden, but in the slow and cruel way that some diseases have, and I was with her until the end. It was during those last days, when lucidity came and went like the tide, that she started talking about the village. She said disconnected things, or at least that's what I thought at first. She mentioned names. She mentioned dates. One night, I think it was 2 weeks before she died, she took my hand with a strength that didn't seem possible in someone so frail and said to me, "Don't go looking for what we left behind. Promise me." I promised her because it was what she needed to hear. She died 10 days later, and I was left with that promise like a weight on my chest, and also with something else, curiosity, which is the most dangerous thing there is. I found the name of the village among his papers. I also found a rusty key inside an unmarked envelope, and inside the envelope a folded piece of paper with an address written by hand. The address was that of a house. I recognized it. It was my grandmother's house. I told myself that I would just go see what was left, that perhaps there were assets to manage, documents, some legal responsibility that my mother had left pending. I told myself I was an adult and rational person, that there was nothing to fear in an old house that was probably in ruins. I told myself all that with the conviction of someone who is lying to themselves. The town was 4 hours away from Bogota. I called my cousin Lucia to tell her what I had found. She was silent on the other end of the line for a moment that felt too long before saying, "Valentina, don't go." I asked her why. She said, "Because I went 3 years ago and was sick for a month after returning. I don't know what that place is, but something is not right there." I told her it was probably just a coincidence. She said, "Yes, probably," but it didn't seem to me that she believed it. I went anyway. I left early on a Friday, with my small car, with a suitcase for a weekend, with the rusty key in the pocket of my coat. The road to the village climbs up a mountain road that at some point stops being a dual carriageway and becomes something more like a path than a public road. The trees begin to close in. The light changes. It's not that it gets dark, but that it becomes different, as if the sun that reaches there had passed through a filter that no one deliberately installed. I arrived in the village around noon. It was smaller than I remembered, or perhaps my childhood memory had amplified it. A central square with a fountain that no longer worked. A church with white walls and peeling plaster. A store, a couple of houses, dogs that looked at me from the sidewalks with a calmness that didn't seem natural. There were very few people outside, and those who were looked at me in a way I couldn't quite describe. It wasn't hostility. It was something closer to recognition, as if they were expecting me, which was impossible because I hadn't notified anyone. I found the house without difficulty. It was at the edge of the village, almost where the houses ended and the mountain began. It was a low construction, with walls made of wattle and daub painted a white that time had worn to gray. It had a thick wooden door, locked with a padlock. I used the key. The padlock yielded without resistance, which seemed strange to me given how long it had been unused. Inside, it smelled of something I recognized immediately. That same bitter herb from childhood. It was impossible for the scent to linger after so many years, and yet there it was, intact, as if someone had burned something that very morning. The rooms were empty of furniture, but not of things. There were jars on the kitchen shelves with contents I couldn't identify. There were marks on the floor of the main room, traced with what looked like charcoal in patterns I didn't recognize, but that caused me immediate physical discomfort. The same feeling one gets from staring at something nonsensical for too long. In the center of the room, there was a small table on which lay an object covered with a black cloth. I didn't uncover it. Not yet. I told myself I needed air first. I went outside and stood in the small, dry dirt yard looking at the mountain behind the house. It was then that I heard footsteps on the gravel beside me and turned to find an old woman looking at me with light eyes that didn't match the rest of her dark, wrinkled face. She said to me, "You are Rosalba's granddaughter." It wasn't a question. I said yes. She nodded slowly. I asked her how she knew. She said, "Because you have her same hands." I looked at my hands, long and dark. I had never noticed it that way. The old woman's name was Doña Carmenza, and she told me she had been my grandmother's closest neighbor for over 40 years. She invited me to her house for panela water, and I accepted because something in the way she looked at me told me that she knew things I needed to know. We sat in her wooden corridor overlooking the empty street. She prepared the panela water leisurely and then sat across from me and asked me directly, "Do you know why you came back?" I told her no, that I thought it was to see the house. She shook her head. She said, "You came because the time has come. It always comes." I asked her what she meant by that. She took a long sip from her cup before answering. What she told me that afternoon, sitting in that corridor while the town fell silent around us, is what I will try to reproduce as accurately as possible, not because I expect you to believe it, but because I need it out of me. My grandmother, according to Doña Carmenza, had been what people in the village called a rezandera, which is a term that can mean many things depending on who you ask. Some rezanderas are pious women who accompany mornings and know ancient prayers. Others are something more complicated. My grandmother was something more complicated. The people of the village brought her problems that the doctor couldn't solve and that the priest didn't want to hear, and she resolved them. Rare diseases, grudges that wouldn't yield, businesses that wouldn't thrive, loves that didn't come to fruition. She resolved them in ways that Doña Carmenza described carefully, as if she chose each word so that it wouldn't sound worse than it already did. But all of that had a cost. And the cost, Doña Carmenza told me, was not paid by my grandmother. Or not completely. It was paid by something she had summoned many years ago, in the times when she was young and desperate, on a night that no one witnessed but left marks on her forever. She never spoke of that night directly, but her neighbors saw it in her, in the change that occurred from one month to the next, in how she went from being an ordinary woman to someone whom people feared and at the same time sought out. That something she had summoned had demands. Doña Carmenza did not call it a demon, but used a word in a very low voice that I could not quite hear, or perhaps did not want to. And one of the demands, she told me, was that the bond did not end with my grandmother's death. It continued. There was always a descendant, a woman with the same long, dark hands, and that bond sought her out. Sooner or later, I asked her why my mother had taken us out of the village. Doña Carmenza said to me, "Your mother spent her life fleeing, and she succeeded for a long time." She paused. "You did not flee. You returned." I entered my grandmother's house again when the sun was already setting. This time I went straight to the main room. I stood in front of the small table. The black cloth was still on top of the object. I could feel something nameless, a presence that was not exactly a pressure but rather its absence, as if the air around that table weighed less, as if something was consuming it. I uncovered it. It was an old black clay bowl, cracked but not completely broken. Inside there was dry earth and something that at some point had been a plant but was now just dark dust. And in the center of that dust was a tiny figure, carved from what seemed like bone, with a vaguely human shape but with incorrect proportions, the arms too long, the head slightly tilted as if listening to something. The moment I saw it, the exact moment my eyes landed on that figure, I heard a sound. It didn't come from outside or from any specific point in the room. It came from inside my own head, like when one hears a high-pitched tone after a blow, but it wasn't a tone. It was something that resembled breathing, slow, steady, interested. I covered the bowl again. That night I slept in the car, parked in the town square, with the doors locked and the heating on even though it wasn't cold enough to justify it. I didn't sleep well. Every time I fell asleep, I saw the same fragments. A moonless night. An open space I couldn't place. A figure of distorted proportions approaching from afar with a slowness that was worse than speed. And my own hands, extended in front of me, waiting to receive something. At 6 in the morning, when it was just starting to get light, someone knocked on my window. I woke up suddenly with my heart in my throat. It was Father Esteban, the town priest, a man in his 60s with a face that looked like he hadn't slept well in several days. He gestured for me to roll down the window. I did. He told me without preamble, "Doña Carmenza informed me that you were here." I said yes. He said, "I need you to listen to something important before I do anything else with what I found in that house." We sat on the steps of the church. The town was still asleep around us. He spoke to me for almost an hour, and what he told me contradicted some things that Doña Carmenza had said, but it agreed on the essentials. Yes, my grandmother had made a pact. Yes, that pact had a logic of inheritance that he couldn't explain theologically but had seen operate in that town more than once. And yes, the object that was in the house was the center of that bond. What he told me additionally, and what Doña Carmenza hadn't told me, was that the bond was not indestructible, that there was a way to end it, that my grandmother had known, but had chosen not to, because ending the bond meant renouncing the power it gave her and she hadn't wanted to, that perhaps my mother had known it too, but had preferred to flee, that I now had an option that the two previous ones had not exercised. I asked him what that way was. He hesitated. Then he said, "The object has to be destroyed in a specific way, and it has to be done by a descendant, not by someone outside. If someone outside tries to destroy it, it doesn't work. That has already been attempted." I asked him when. He looked at me. 3 years ago, a young woman came to the village, entered the house, tried to break the bowl. I then understood what had happened to Lucia, the month-long illness she had attributed to coincidence. I asked him how it was destroyed. He explained to me. It was a process that involved a specific prayer that he would write on a piece of paper, fire, and take the remains outside the property before dawn completely. He told me there was a risk, that during the process something would try to dissuade me, that he hadn't seen it done the same way twice, that it could be a sound or an image or a thought that wasn't mine, that the instruction, the only instruction, was not to interrupt the process once it had begun. That night I did it. There was moonlight, which I appreciated, although I don't quite know why. I entered the house with a candle, the paper with Father Esteban's prayer, and a lighter. The marks on the ground seemed darker than the day before, or maybe it was the light. I went to the main room. I uncovered the bowl for the second time. The bone figure was in a different position. I was sure I had left her with her head tilted to the left. Now it was upright, with her head looking up at me. I started to read the prayer aloud. It was in Old Spanish, with some words I didn't recognize, and Father Esteban had told me to pronounce them as best I could, even if I didn't understand them. I read slowly. The candle cast shadows that moved more than the movement of the flame justified. It was when I reached the middle of the prayer that it started. First was the breath, the same as the night before, inside my head, but closer now, more defined, and with it a thought that came with a terrifying clarity, that it wouldn't end, that there was no need to end anything, that I could have what my grandmother had, the power to resolve what the doctor and the priest could not resolve, the hands capable of things that other hands could not. The thought had a voice that was not exactly a voice but functioned like one. And the voice had a warmth. I kept reading. The thought became more insistent. It offered me concrete things I wanted, some of which I had never said out loud. My mind produced them with a clarity that made me doubt for a moment whether those thoughts were mine or theirs, if there was a distinction. I kept reading. When I finished the sentence, I placed the lit paper in the bowl. The dry earth and plant dust caught fire quickly. The bone figure took longer, but it ignited. There was a smell I couldn't describe, not exactly unpleasant, something between resin and wet earth and something else that has no name. What happened while it burned was the hardest to put into words. I heard, with my ears and not just in my head, a sound that was almost a language but not quite. I couldn't understand what it was saying, but I understood the tone. It was the tone of something that did not expect this outcome, that had hoped that I, like my grandmother and like my mother, would choose differently. And in that tone, there was something I interpreted, perhaps incorrectly, as indignation, like the surprise of someone who has collected a debt for generations and suddenly finds that someone is not paying it. I took the remains when the fire went out. Earth, dust, charcoal, fragments of the bowl broken by the heat. I put them in a cloth bag that I had brought prepared. I left the house before dawn was finished and walked to where the road leaving the village turned into a mountain, and there I buried the bag under a tree that I chose without any particular criteria, just because it was there. I returned to the car. I started it. I began to go down the mountain. They were the 4 longest kilometers of my life. Not because of what happened, but because of what didn't happen. Nothing. The silence inside my head was so complete, so different from what it had been during the last hours, that it almost hurt. It was the silence of a frequency that is cut off. The silence of something that is leaving. When I reached the main road and the path became 2 lanes, I pulled the car over to the side and sat still for several minutes. I realized I was crying. I don't know exactly why. It wasn't pure relief, nor was it pure sadness. It was something in between, the feeling of having closed something that had been open for decades, something I didn't even know was open. I called Father Esteban to tell him I had finished. He was silent for a moment. Then he said, "May God be with you, miss." And he hung up. I called Lucia. I told her everything. She also fell silent for a while, and then she asked me, "How do you feel?" I told her the truth. I still didn't know. In the weeks that followed, I noticed some things. That I was sleeping differently, more deeply, and with fewer dreams. That my hands, my long dark hands, looked the same as always, but I looked at them differently, with less discomfort. That certain ideas that had floated in my mind since childhood, ideas that I always believed were my own but perhaps were not entirely, were no longer there. I did not return to the village. The house is still there, I suppose. Doña Carmenza is still there, I suppose. Father Esteban, too. There is one thing I still don't know for sure and probably never will. Whether what I did worked, or if what I did was simply what that wanted me to believe I was doing. Whether the destruction of the object was the end of the bond, or if the bond has ways of persisting that I don't understand, and that will only become evident later on. Sometimes, in that space between sleep and wakefulness, I hear something. Very distant. Like a breath that isn't mine, but only very occasionally, and less each time. I hope so. So far this is what Valentina wrote to me. She says that since then she hasn't returned to the village, and that she doesn't plan to do so either. What struck me about her story was not so much what happened in that house, but the image of 3 women, her grandmother, her mother, and herself, each facing the same inheritance in completely different ways. If you have a story that has haunted you, something you need to get out, I invite you to share it in the comments or send it to me. This channel exists thanks to those who dare to tell. And if you enjoy this kind of stories and are not subscribed yet, consider staying. Have a peaceful night. We'll talk soon.